At the start of Henry Temple's second administration, the French Republic under Napoleon III was continuing to flex its expansionary muscles. Sardinia, in its efforts to expel the Austrians from controlling mainland Italy, turned to the French for their assistance in invading in exchange for transferring ownership of the Duchy of Savoy and the County of Nice. These new territories for France and the resulting increase in their power began to frighten the British, and in 1860, Temple established the Royal Commission on the Defense of the United Kingdom, which would oversee the construction of new coastal forts along Britain's coasts to replace the aging Martello towers. These new fortifications would become known as Palmerston Forts, named after the Temple family's royal title. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, Temple was torn on which side to support. While he was opposed to the continuation of the institution of slavery, he had despised the United States his entire life and saw that if the Civil War were to succeed, that it would be a beneficial development for the United Kingdom in its quest to maintain its dominance now as the world's greatest power. Temple also saw the Confederate States of America as a premier trading partner in that they could supply cotton for Britain's booming textile industry. While Britain officially took a neutral stance in the conflict, Temple's administration had secretly been making efforts to establish a diplomatic relationship with the Confederates in the chance that they became an independent nation. It was in the first year that a small group of Confederate diplomats boarded the British HMS Trent and sailed back to Britain with the goal of establishing these initial diplomatic ties. Union intelligence anticipated the movements of the Confederate diplomats, and the USS San Jacinto was ordered to intercept the Trent and capture the diplomats. The interception of the Trent and the outcry it caused across the British public became known as the Trent Affair. As a result, Temple ordered a complete freeze of diplomatic ties with the U.S. until they agreed to release the diplomats and give an official apology. Not wanting Britain to diplomatically recognize the Confederacy, or worse, join the war on their side, President Abraham Lincoln complied in order to keep the Union economy humming. The Trent Affair would not be the only conflict between the British and Americans during the latter Civil War. While the British were supposed to be neutral, they had been using their naval yards to build warships for the Confederates, the most famous of these being the CSS Alabama. The Alabama would get into a naval firefight with a Union ship in the English Channel, resulting in it being sunk. For the next decade, the Americans would take the UK to international arbitration for the breaking of neutrality and the loss of property, and they would ultimately be victorious with the signing of the Treaty of Washington, where the UK agreed to pay the US $15.5 million in damages. In 1864, conflict was beginning to brew again closer to home over a return to the Schleswig-Holstein question. The Prussians, who had spent their time since the last invasion of Denmark building up their army, jointly invaded Denmark with Austria, beginning the Second Schleswig War. Temple still believed that France was Britain's main adversary, and despite Denmark's pleas for military assistance against the invasion, he ordered the British Army and Navy not to intervene unless Denmark's sovereignty was at stake. The result was that Denmark was defeated within 8 months and was forced to hand over Schleswig-Holstein to the Germans. The loss had little to no effect on British public opinion of Temple, and he was instead credited with keeping the nation out of war, and he was reelected in 1865, managing to expand the Liberal majority. Another reason Temple did not like or trust the Americans was due to the huge number of Irish immigrants who had moved to their many industrial cities in the North. Many Irish Americans were radically anti-British, and in 1867, an Irish secret society was formed in New York City called the Fenian Brotherhood, which would go on to organize cross-border raids into Canada in efforts to pressure the British into giving Ireland its independence. Simultaneously, revolutionaries in Ireland, as part of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, worked in conjunction with the raiders as part of a coordinated effort known as the Fenian Rising. So the raids had little effect on the British occupation of Ireland across the Atlantic, and the uprising in Ireland was poorly planned and executed, leading to the Irish Republican Brotherhood to postpone their efforts for independence. Temple would unfortunately fall ill with a fever and pass away shortly after his reelection, and he was followed by fellow Liberal John Russell, who had previously served as Prime Minister under the Whig label. Russell's second premiership would be marred by gridlock and ended up being short-lived. He would be voted out of office the following year and was replaced with two-time former Conservative Prime Minister George Stanley. Stanley's shining achievement in his third term was the passage of the Reform Act of 1867, which extended the right to vote beyond property-owning individuals to British men who paid rent. Prior to the Act's passage, approximately 7% of British adults could vote. This portion increased to 14% following its adoption. Unfortunately for Stanley, his health began to quickly fade in his elder years, and he decided to retire in the final year of his life, being followed by his deputy, Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli, who was the only prime minister to be born ethnically Jewish, converted to the Anglican Church at the age of 12 after his father removed his family from the religion. In 1868, he oversaw the passage of the Corrupt Practices Act, which moved the responsibility of electoral arbitration from Parliament itself to the courts, which reduced opportunities for corruption and increased election integrity. By this year, the Ethiopian Empire was beginning to collapse into popular revolt, with Emperor Theodosius the second writing many diplomatic pleas to the various European great powers asking for assistance in maintaining his regime. The internal weakness of the Ethiopian government at this point encouraged Islamic raiders from Sudan and Egypt to invade the country, further causing strain. Tewodros II attempted to appeal to the British by recognizing that the countries were fellow Christian nations. These overtures did not sway the British, who had chosen to align themselves with Sudan and Egypt in the region not because of their religion, but because of their large-scale production of cotton, where Britain had been required to purchase as a result of the American Civil War and the drop in the supply of Confederate cotton. Tewodros II then retreated to his mountaintop palace with his guards and waited for a response. When no response came, he decided to take drastic measures, and he ordered the capture and imprisonment of British missionaries who had been operating in the country in hopes that by taking hostages, he would bring attention to his plight. Instead, the British sent an army force of 13,000 soldiers to invade Ethiopia and rescue the hostages. Despite Ethiopia's rugged terrain and lack of road network, the British were able to reach Tewodros II's remote palace, which they laid siege to. Running out of options, Tewodros II committed suicide, and the British claimed victory. Despite these major events, the most consequential issue of 1868 was on whether to reform the Anglican Church of Ireland. While a majority of Irish were Catholic, the systems of land ownership were overseen and controlled by the Anglicans through the church. Disraeli believed that the continuation of this current system would lead to continued Fenian uprisings, and he supported allowing land ownership in Ireland to be granted to the Catholic Church. This position greatly angered the Liberals, who saw converting the Irish to the Anglican Church as a matter of societal progress, and they were able to channel their anger and topple Disraeli within the year, with him being followed by Liberal William Gladstone. Gladstone was a strong believer in the power of free market forces, and he made it his priority to reduce taxes and government spending to the lowest level possible, since he believed that the citizens were better off when they had more agency on how to spend their money. At the same time, he worked to dismantle the somewhat new welfare system in place to promote the liberal capitalist view of self-reliance. These moves caused anger among the people who relied on these services, and the backlash resulted in the creation of the New Social Alliance, which was a caucus within the Conservative Party that advocated for the continuation of the existing welfare system. It is important to note that at present we generally associate increases in welfare spending as a form of progress, but at this time it was considered outdated and counterproductive. Thus, the progressives wanted to push progress forward by dismantling the welfare system, and the conservatives wanted to maintain the status quo. The goal of the New Social Alliance was to combine the forces of the landowning aristocrats with the working poor against the up-and-coming merchant capitalist class. Gladstone reformed the army by removing the ability for wealthy individuals to purchase officer ranks. He banned disciplinary whippings of soldiers during peacetime. He oversaw the passage of the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which allocated funds to construct and maintain schools for British children between the ages of 5 and 12. 1871 saw the passage of the Trade Union Act, which permitted the formation of trade unions in the country for the first time, as well as the Universities Tests Act, which made it illegal to require tests over knowledge of Anglican teachings when qualifying for university admissions. The following year saw the passage of the Ballot Act of 1872, which reformed elections to make the voting process to use secretive ballots, whereas previously voting was done at an open convention setting. The Licensing Act of 1872 made it illegal to be intoxicated in public or while operating machinery or riding a draft animal. It also established the rule that bars had to close by midnight in cities and by 11 p.m. in rural areas. The act regulated the contents of beer, ending the common practice at the time to add salt to the beer to make the drinker thirsty and more likely to consume more drinks. Finally, it gave local governments the option to become dry jurisdictions by banning alcohol in their borough. Gladstone also sanctioned a scientific voyage of the ship, the HMS Challenger, to circumvent the world and collect new scientific specimens, beginning the modern British and liberal obsession with cataloging the contents of the universe in order to try to manage them. The expedition saw the discovery of 4,000 previously unknown species and resulted in the first known photographs of an iceberg. The ship used primitive depth sounding techniques by dropping a line to the ocean floor to measure its distance from the ship. Through this practice, the ship discovered the Mariana Trench at its deepest point, known today as Challenger Deep in honor of the expedition. Despite the fact that Gladstone and the Liberal Party were decently successful, their weakness with the aristocracy and working class allowed the Conservatives and their leader Benjamin Disraeli to make a comeback in 1874. Disraeli's second premiership saw the passage of several reforms. The Artisans and Laborers' Dwellings Improvement Act of 1875 allocated money to local governments to be used to purchase slum houses and redevelop them into modern public housing for the poor. The Public Health Act of 1875 mandated that all new housing built had to come with running water and that all new streets had to be paved and adequately illuminated by streetlights. The Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act finally fully legalized labor unions by permitting the practice of going on strike, and also somewhat unrelatedly made it a crime to stalk another person. Finally, the Employers and Workmen Act modified the existing common law by establishing the provision of the legal remedy of specific performance, which is granted to a plaintiff in a civil case when the legal damages are not adequate to make them whole. A good example of specific performance, which continues today as an integral part of contract law, is when a contractor is paid to construct a building but decides to quit the job halfway to completion. In this instance, the contractor simply returning half of the pay is not adequate to compensate the plaintiff for the troubles of having to deal with a half-finished building. So a remedy of specific performance could be granted by the court to force the contractor to finish the job they originally agreed to. Starting in the previous decade, France began financing the construction of the Suez Canal to connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea in a deal that saw the French government own 55% of the canal and 45% going to the Khedivate of Egypt at a time. 50% to France, 50 to Egypt, but it's split between the Ottomans and then the Khedivate government. By 1875, the Khedivate wanted to sell its share in the canal, and upon hearing the news, Disraeli sent a delegation to Egypt to organize the purchase. The assumption of the Khedivate's interest in the canal proved to be hugely popular back home among British citizens, and in 1876, at the request of Queen Victoria, Disraeli sponsored and passed the Royal Titles Act, which officially designated her not only as the Queen, but as an empress as well, reflecting the government's annexation of India as a colony. In 1876, Christian Serbs in the region of Herzegovina began an uprising against their Ottoman overlords. Sensing that the empire was weak, ethnic Bulgars began their own insurrection known as the April Uprising of 1876, with the goal of securing an independent Bulgarian state. As a result, the Ottomans sent in soldiers to stop the revolution. At the Bulgarian town of Batak, these soldiers opened fire on a crowd, killing 5,000 civilians in what became known as the Batak Massacre. News of the massacre quickly spread across the continent at the behest of two American journalists who were living in Turkey at the time and covering stories related to the Ottoman army. The Russians, with the goal of protecting or annexing the lands of their Slavic neighbors, began to prepare to go to war with the Ottomans. While Disraeli at first attempted to deny stories of the Batak massacre as nothing but rumors, the outrage in the British public was so great that he was unable to intervene on the Ottomans' behalf against Russia, so he instead watched from the sidelines as the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 began. By the following year, the Ottomans were forced to surrender and relinquish their control of Bulgaria, which subsequently became an independent state under Russian protection. Britain, along with the unified support of most of Europe, pressured Russia to finalize their claims at a treaty convention called the Congress of Berlin. The British, who feared that Russia's new annexations would make them too powerful, were able to convince the Ottomans to cede the island of Cyprus, to the British as a form of foreign protection against further Russian aggression. Still fearful of Russian expansion into other regions, chief among them Afghanistan, which directly bordered British India, the British invaded the country in 1878 to overthrow the existing ruler who had been receptive to Russian peace delegations and instead replaced him with a leader loyal to the British, starting the Second Anglo-Afghan War. This coup was just a small piece of the larger geopolitical game being played between Britain and Russia, which is known as the Great Game, and who at this moment were the world's two most formidable superpowers. Following the successful creation of the Federation of Canada, the British wanted to do the same to their possessions in South Africa, with the goal of reunifying them with the nearby independent Dutch Boer republics. In order to do this, the British believed they had to first consolidate their control within the existing colonies of Cape Town and Natal. So they launched a military campaign against the native Zulu people who had thus far been awarded a certain level of autonomy. Despite facing steep losses early on to Zulu warriors, the British were able to decisively defeat them within the year, something Disraeli hoped would help him win election. In preparation for the upcoming election, the Liberals sent representatives to America to observe and learn from their political process and how they manage their parties, something that the Liberals believed the Conservatives presently had the advantage in. What they observed was the American politicians spent a great deal of time leading up to the election campaigning by traveling around the country and making speeches to potential voters. William Gladstone, who was running for re-election as the Liberal candidate, decided to follow this advice and launch his own American-style campaign called the Midlothian Campaign, which saw him travel across Britain delivering impassioned stump speeches. While the Conservatives believed the election would be close due to earlier negative publicity around the handling of the start of the Anglo-Zulu War, Gladstone's hard work paid off, and the Liberals ended up handing the Conservatives a resounding defeat, proving the importance of campaigning in British elections, and which would become a permanent feature of future elections. After Gladstone's electoral victory in 1880, Disraeli would retire and spend his time writing romance novels, a lifelong pastime of his. Disraeli, who had struggled with physical illness for his entire life, passed away in 1881 from bronchitis. The anniversary of his death was marked by a public holiday in Britain known as Primrose Day, which persisted in practice until the 1920s.